The views and opinions heard on this show do not necessarily reflect the views of the host.
There had to be someone, not something, because things were out, second law of thermodynamics. There had to be someone without beginning or end who had the power and the knowledge, the wisdom, the incredible, infinite intelligence to put all this together, from the organization of the atom to the cosmos and so forth.
When we look at the many examples of God's power, it should invoke a sense of reverence and awe in our hearts.
Truly, our Creator is the God of wonders, and the greatest wonder is His immeasurable love.
Welcome to another edition of Real Spiritual Talk Radio. I'm your host, Lamont Gates, bringing you the world of faith, metaphysicalism, and spirituality. Today, as we continue with our series of near-death experience accounts, I am joined by another experiencer who learned a lot more about self-concept on her journey. Let's get it started. Ladies and gentlemen, joining me via telephone is Amber Lynn. Amber, welcome to the broadcast.
Thank you. Good morning.
Well, I want to thank you for joining me today to discuss your near-death experience, as it is my understanding that on the near-death experience group site on Facebook, you just revealed your account for the very first time. Am I right?
Aside from telling a few close friends over the years, yeah.
Great to know. Takes courage a lot of times after an account, from what I understand, to share one, especially to the overly sometimes judgmental internet crowd. So why don't we go backwards first? Before we delve into your near-death experience account, why don't we discuss what life was like for you prior to your near-death experience? What was your upbringing like? What were some of the religious overtones or belief systems that you grew up with or were taught by parents or adults?
Right, so I didn't mention any of that when I shared my experience. I grew up in a fairly, good middle-class family. There was some Catholicism. My grandma was a very adamant, straight Catholic. She went to church every week. She prayed with her rosary. She lost her husband when her youngest child was a year old and ended up raising 11 kids by herself. An amazing, strong woman with a very strong faith. I wasn't around her much growing up, though. We started moving. We moved to a different state every couple of years throughout my growing up. Between that and a sexual assault when I was 13 by the captain of the swim team that I didn't tell anyone about
Wow.
or process, I began using drugs as a teenager. So by the time I had this experience, I was already a full-blown addict.
And how old were you when you had your near-death experience?
I was 20 or 21.
So you were fairly young when you had your account. You mentioned being involved with someone romantically on your posts that had some sort of connection to your near-death experience?
I had unknowingly entered into a very abusive relationship. Like most abusive relationships, I think I was singled out by the predator. They systematically go about manipulating. They find ways to entrap you. They have manipulations that they do, and I'd never been through something like that before. So by the time this person's true colors started to come out, I was already homeless, lost my job, my place to live, and was in a pretty dependent, frightened situation with this person. I would leave. There was a few times where I would leave, and he would track me down and he would find me. So a lot of it was very fear-based, and then, of course, fueled by drugs. So I was in this really scary trap place in my life.
Did you ever make an attempt to leave at all?
Yeah, I did. A few times. One time he had even forced me into a car. I was walking down the street in broad daylight with a friend and her son on my way to work. I was working at a hotel and living there because I had gotten away from him. And he pulled up in the car. His mother was actually driving. If it's crazier. Forced me into the back of the car, beat me up in the back of the car, burnt me with cigarettes, told me that we were going to go for a long drive, and when we stopped the car, his mother was going to watch while he beat me to death. And then we ended up going to his house instead, where he started crying and apologizing and sent me on a bus back to work, where my friend that was with me had called the police, and they went and they got him. They took pictures of my face. So that was one time where charges were actually pressed on this person. And I believe this experience was months later after that. I had gotten away from him. And it's something, you know, I'm embarrassed about now, looking back on. I question, well, why would I have ever put up with that? Why would I have ever stayed in that situation? But we do what we know at the time.
Right. And I wanted to ask, what exactly did all of that do to your self-esteem level?
I was pretty worthless. I didn't have much, if any, self-esteem. It was a very lost time.
Yeah, it sounds to me that he'd be the type that would apologize after doing something wrong, in this case brutally wrong, but you'd tend to go back to him. Yeah. Is that so?
Yeah, and then of course he had another side, like most abusers do. They have a very charming, engaging, loving, you know, friendly side that they can show as well, and that's what draws people in, and that's what brings people back and makes people think that there's hope if they could just love them enough or get through to them, or, you know, whatever it is.
This, unfortunately, is very true with many domestic cases, and yours wouldn't be the first and most likely not the last. So why don't we just get into it? Talk to me about how your near-death experience came about.
Yeah, we were at a friend's apartment. We'd been sort of staying there on and off. You know, we just sort of stayed wherever we ended up being able to at the time. The main drug that we were using at the time was methamphetamine. I don't believe that we had any that day that this happened. I don't remember though. And we were in a room and he was just started kind of pacing around the room and acting agitated for no particular reason. Nothing had set him off that I knew of. We hadn't been fighting. None of that. There was no warning that I could see anyway. And he started attacking me. He came on to me. He pushed me down on a bed, fully clothed. This wasn't sexual in nature at all. And began choking me. You know, I thought he'd never done that before. That was new. And I didn't really know, you know, what to think, but I know that I thought he was going to stop. And he didn't. He continued to choke me, and he crawled on top of me. He had his full body weight on top of me, pressing down. And I remember trying to kick and push him off with my legs. And I remember trying to grab at him with my arms and do everything that I could to push him and to get him off of me. And he just wasn't stopping. And then I remember the realization that he wasn't going to stop, and there was absolutely nothing I can do about it. And the panic that came along with that, realizing that, you know, this might be the end. And then I remember being gone. I wasn't there anymore, but I was in a tunnel, like a dark tunnel, but it wasn't dark. It was full of lights, and they were lights of every color I could ever imagine, and colors that I've never seen and can't imagine, if that makes any sense. They were like in flashing lights. They were all put together. I'm sure it was in some pattern, but I don't know what. And I was moving at light speed and moving through this tunnel, not straight, but it was windy and curvy, and it did drop down. And it was at light speed. It was really exhilarating, but it was also kind of scary because it was so fast, and you know, as humans, we don't move that fast, but I was still aware of my essence, I want to say. I don't want to say body, but I could still feel the sensation of how fast I was moving. And then that tunnel eventually popped me out into this expansive meadow. Like, it was like a meadow that you would see on Earth, only way, way more beautiful. And the air in the meadow was warm, and it was like a comforting bone soothing kind of warmth, even though I don't believe there was bones.
You would say your consciousness pretty much was still intact.
My consciousness could feel these sensations, like the sensation of the warm air and how it soothed my consciousness, and I could smell it, and it had this sweet, sweet smell, and I just had this feeling of peace and like I'd never experienced before, and of understanding. Like everything made sense. I wasn't worried about anything. I wasn't anxious about anything. It was like the feeling I realized that I had been searching for all those years and trying to find in substances, but it was so much beyond anything that I had ever found.
Aside from this beautiful landscape that you witnessed on this other side, this other realm, did you see any entities? Did you hear anything? A lot of people talk about communication being telepathic on that side.
Communication was definitely telepathic, but for me, it wasn't with any entities that I saw or heard. It was with nature. The meadow was full of bright green grass. It was like a warm summer spring day. And I think butterflies, lots of wildflowers, and the communication was more with the flowers and the nature in the place. And there was a tree in the middle of the meadow, a single tree, not anything too impressive, not very tall, like a medium-sized kind of shrubby tree. And it really stood out to me for some reason. But I kept going, and I kept flying is how I would describe it, because I felt like I was flying over and through this meadow. Past all of that, and I started going around a corner to the right. And as I was going around this corner, it was leaving the meadow. And I saw two white, like old Greek-style pillars, and I was getting ready to go through them. And I remember being excited to see what was through those pillars when I started seeing the bright light. And I remember thinking, this must be the light that people talk about when they die. So I'm on the right path. I need to go to the light. And then I saw a figure in the light, and I thought, oh, this must be an angel. It was a long-haired, tall man. But as the light got brighter and there started to be dark edges around the sides of it, I realized that it was the light in the room, and the figure standing there was my ex-boyfriend.
So the tall, long-haired figure that you saw, did your boyfriend at the time have any of these features?
Yes, he was.
Okay, so it seems like the realms were being interwoven after you returned.
That's what it seemed like. That is what it felt like. And I was mad. I was so angry. I did not want to come back. I didn't want to be there. I wanted to stay in the place where I was. And I wanted to see what was through those pillars.
Take us through what happened next after you returned.
Well, he was looking at me with horror and shock. I remember that. And I don't know if that was because of what he had just done, or because I came back, or because when I woke up I said, it's so beautiful, it's so beautiful, I love you, it's so beautiful, because that was, with the feelings I still had from being where I was, that was how I felt, because it didn't matter. It was unconditional love. It mattered later, of course, but in that moment, it didn't matter. The details right after are a little blurry. I know that I probably tried to question him about what had happened, and he pushed me out of the room. He locked me out of the room and locked the door and wouldn't come out for hours. And I remember just crying and crying for a couple of hours and just feeling very lost and scared and alone, and not knowing what to do with all of this, or where to go, or who to talk to, or just not having any answers. I'm not a religious or spiritual person, so I didn't pray.
So you came back from this experience and you bursted out pretty much saying to him that you loved him. Did you feel a high amount of love on that other side while you were over there, which, by the way, is very common in near-death experience accounts?
Yeah, complete love. Just complete understanding, unconditional love.
So the only thing you felt you could do immediately was, after returning that is, was express to him pretty much what was expressed to you over there.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that probably scared him more than anything.
So how exactly did you escape from him, finally?
I eventually hid out from him for a few days with my mother's help, actually, because I had signed myself up to go to an inpatient center. And so she helped me find a safe place to stay for a few days before I went. And I went across the state to this inpatient for 3 months. And then I stayed and lived there for a couple of years afterward, so that I could be away from everyone, and all of those influences and just sort of focus on myself and getting my life together.
Right. So when you returned, did you come back with any post-near-death experience sensitivities, any lack of fear of death, any precognition, etc.?
I'd say that it humbled me, for sure. It made me look at myself in a much less important way, and material things no longer meant as much, if really anything. Name brands, having the latest gadgets, or making lots of money, and all of that just wasn't as relevant anymore as truth and relationships and purpose. And I actually I got really into horticulture afterwards. And I started, growing things, growing plants, and really fell in love with gardening and nature and growing. And
Did you have an interest for that prior to your near-death experience?
not that I was aware of. No, I was too caught up in addiction and self-centeredness. And I think I did have some interest in it, but it wasn't nurtured before.
Do you believe the nature on that side that you saw may have brought you back with a higher interest for nature? As you noted, telepathically, these plants were communicating with you.
Possibly. I never even thought of it that way. I did start attending a church for a few years after that. Became really involved with a church, had that longing.
So how did organized religion work for you? Since I know you also complained that the theology of many fringe conservative evangelical Christians was that if you didn't follow my theology, that you were going to burn in hell. And you noted that that didn't affect you anymore. Was that still the case?
Not every time, but I would always come back to that. I'd always come back to reminding myself, who am I going to choose to believe? This person or my own experience? Which has more weight? What this person is saying to me from a book that they've read, or my own personal experience. And so after years of battling with that, actually chosen to believe my own personal experience.
And see, I believe that's an extremely strong argument for your experience. And that's exactly why I'm so into near-death experiences, because that's exactly what they are. They're experiences versus someone who only has either a belief system or an interpretation out of a book, not even mentioning that their interpretation of that book may not even be correct. What was the reaction to your account when you first revealed it to other people?
The few people that I told within a few years afterward didn't have much of a reaction. They didn't really have a lot to say about it either way. I know that one of them was very Christian and very kind of like, I guess you would call a zealot, into ministry and lived and breathed Jesus, and so he probably just sort of chalked it up as something that happens. I don't know. And then the other one that I told was not spiritual at all.
Were they more accepting?
Yeah, but still didn't really mean much to them. It's not something that they ever brought up again or really questioned.
So is there any more church involvement, or have you completely left that fold?
I've moved away from that. I did faithfully for a few years when I first, got clean from the drugs and was finding a new life. And then I just started questioning things, and there was things that just didn't settle well with me, and it felt like I was living my truth, and like I was in a constant battle with myself over living my truth versus living the way that these people are saying I should. And then years later, I gave it another try and dove headfirst into it again, and with the same result. Within a few years, I came back to that I just need to live my own truth and take my chances.
You had also mentioned on your post when you revealed your near-death experience that you ran into skeptics who tried to just explain away your account from a physicalist perspective or explanation. In other words, I noticed that you said there were those who claimed that you may have just lost oxygen in the brain, which made you see what you saw. Can you explain a little bit about that?
Right. So the main person that had me question it is an atheist and has been for years. And so this person doesn't, really give credit to anything spiritual or religious. Everything's logic, everything's science. And so it did make me question it. It did make me question if maybe our brains release some kind of chemicals like DMT or something else as we're dying or as we're getting ready to die. And that's probably what led me to the Facebook group, to hear more about other people's experiences and be able to compare them to my own.
It was Dr. Raymond Moody, the author of the classic Life After Life, who also coined the term near-death experience, who stated in his book under the explanations section that, quote, explanations are in some respects projections of the egos of the persons who hold them. In other words, if a person is trained in this belief system, and just as you have fringe conservative right-wing Christian absolutists, you've got the so-called science-minded absolutists who believes that the only thing they see, feel, hear, touch, or taste are the only things that actually exist. Now, it's funny, you mentioned DMT. There is another author by the name of Eben Alexander, who was a neuroscientist who, like you, also had a near-death experience, to which he went into this beautiful landscape, and his was a bit longer and transcendental, so it seemed, but he came back and in the back of his book, on his explanations page, questioning the physicalist concept, he stated that the neocortex of his brain was non-functional. It was shut off, so that DMT had no way of actually interfering with that area. So the DMT argument is out the window, and there's no one greater than Eben Alexander, who is actually a neuroscientist, to explain this information for us. But going back to oxygen being lost in the brain, which is also known as brain hypoxia, that's a paradoxical argument in itself, being that none of the symptoms of brain hypoxia is hallucination. In fact, what typically happens in severe oxygen loss to the brain is either coma or brain death, which means you're not having a lucid experience, and there's no way you're having a hallucination because the brain is completely shut off. It was also Dr. Jeffrey Long who stated in one of the books that he wrote himself, who also has a website dedicated to thousands of near-death experiences and a database he created, that there's at least 20 different theories or hypotheses in this case on near-death experiences as it pertains to the physicalist argument, but that if you've got 20 different hypotheses, you clearly don't have an answer. So I go back to people like you who have the actual experience. For example, I would ask you whether or not your experience was more hyper real than that, let's say, of a dream state. What would you say to me?
Oh, 100% more real than a dream state. It was fully aware of everything. You know how in dreams it's sort of sometimes like watching a movie that you're the main character in. It wasn't like that. I was fully present. And here 20 years later, I can still remember and describe the experience.
So what would you tell those who question near-death experiences, who may fear death, who believes that their religion or their scientific perspective of things are the only absolutist answers?
I would just like to encourage people to keep an open mind and spirit and realize that in the vastness of our universe, we are a speck of dust. So we really don't have, hardly any answers. And also from my experience, take that I was a wreck living in sin with no real spiritual connection or practicing religion. And I went to a place more beautiful than I can describe. So that, for me, that took away a lot of fear, and I hope that it would for other people as well.
I agree, and ironically, many Christians who are interpreting from the Bible were to open up, for example, the book of Genesis, and they could see that your experience pretty much matches what we see there in terms of this beautiful landscape, like a garden landscape you were in. You had this single tree as that of the tree of life. It's, it's fascinating. So would you say that your self-esteem became stronger after this?
Knowing that I was worthy of going somewhere like that, yeah, that changed some things for sure.
Amber, I want to thank you for coming on the show, revealing to us that fascinating experience that you had, and you are now in the upper echelons of many of the other near-death experiencers who come back with such vivid and wonderful accounts. Thank you very much.
Have a good rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you. And I want to thank you all for tuning in. This has been another episode of Real Spiritual Talk Radio. Please come back and join me. The series of near-death experience accounts have not yet ended. I will have future shows with clergy and other accounts as well. But for now, I believe there's something we can all learn from these that hopefully can get us to be more spiritually enlightened. And with that said, I'm your host, Lamont Gates, and Real Spiritual Talk Radio is now signing off.